Serenbe is a place where people live, work, learn, and play in celebration of life's beauty. And we're here to share the stories that connect residents and guests to each other and to nature. This is Serenbe Stories. I want to welcome everybody to Serenbe Stories. I'm Monica Olsen, and I'm here with Steve Nygren, who's the CEO and founder of Serenbe. And we're here today to talk about what is Serenbe. Steve, I want you to imagine I've never been here before. I know it's hard to do because I've lived here for almost 10 years. But if I have never been here, tell me what it is and what it's all about.
The simplest explanation is we're simply a village of people living in a community of trees on the edge of metropolitan Atlanta. Then, of course, you have to get into what does community mean to everyone. And for me, it's just a connection of people living vitally in a life very similar to how we might have lived 80 years ago when we were connected to one another. In a simpler world, but it isn't necessarily the technology that makes our world so complicated. We're not related to one another.
So a community of people living within a community of trees. So is everybody just out in the woods here? What's going on? Is it just people? What else is here besides those people in the trees?
So there is, your definition of community. So where we have defined community is it includes all the aspects of life. So it's a place where art is important, not just performing arts, but the way we build our buildings. Architecture is important. Our street lights are very special. It's a place where we're growing our own food. We know the farmer, but also the things to eat are in the landscape. Blueberries at the crosswalk. It's a place where we think about staying healthy. It's a place where you see people jogging, and there are groups of people meeting for bicycle rides. And so Serenbe is developed in a manner that the entire forest is considered a playground in the streets. And so we see children experiencing nature. And it's amazing to me how many people comment on our free-range kids. And isn't it sad that today we are putting so many of our children behind fences that we notice children that are actually experiencing nature in a natural way?
That's great. That is really great. My kids have such confidence from growing up in this environment. Tell me what else is here. Like, what can I do here? So I can pick blueberries. I can go to a farm. I can bicycle and hit nature. What are the other things I can do here? Is it just houses?
Well, it depends. Do you want to visit for the day? Do you want to change your life? If you're coming for the day, you can come to theater. You can come to a variety of restaurants. We have shops. You can experience various health programs, from yoga to seeing a kinesiology doctor or a Chinese doctor. You can literally decide that you want to change your lifestyle if you're not happy with what you're doing, and really dig in deep and buy a house. Know your neighbors, connect to nature every day. People are really on this idea of mindfulness and the hours it takes you to get your mind clear in meditation. But I find most people can have a 10, 15-minute walk, and it clears your mind in a way that sitting in a circle is more difficult for the average person. We are set up in a series of omegas. And so if you're walking from one side of a street to another, there are paths that take you right through a moment of nature. And that's what I call just a minute reset button, no matter how frustrating the news was that day or personal matters. If you just step into nature, it's a reset on it's a much bigger world and a lot bigger things than what's happening in that moment in your life.
This is great. So if I want to come here for the day, how do I do that? How do I get here? Where are you located?
So we are, while we appear to be very far away in the middle of nowhere, we're actually on the edge of everywhere. And I can say that because we're 25 minutes from an international airport, the busiest international airport that connects you to the capitals of the world. We are on the edge of metropolitan Atlanta. I can get downtown in 35 minutes. And so if you're interested in world-class sports, retail, medical services, it's all right here within a short distance. So literally, you can have whatever experience you want. You can also go back on our back trails and feel like you're in a wilderness. Audubon Society does regular walks here because they find more species this close to metropolitan Atlanta than they can in anywhere. And it's more comparable to places that are far off. And that's part of that is because we've changed zoning on 40,000 acres and we are all organic, so we don't have any chemicals here at Serenbe. And so the natural nature life of animals and plants and trees are more resembling more remote areas. But we're right here on the edge of the city.
Who lives here? What kind of people?
It's curious that people want to know what boxes that people are in. We're so interested, I guess, in the boxes.
Sure.
And real people live here. I think it's self-selecting. It's people that connect with nature, can see the inner reaction on the streets of everyone. But, we have people from various races. We have ages from my grandchild who was just born a few weeks ago to a 91-year-old woman who just bought a house.
Fantastic.
So age-wise, we have economic diversity because of all the rental programs. We have a complete range of people and an extreme range. And I think this is the way most communities used to be. And we've come to a point where we're so focused on the boxes and the idea that all the $1 million houses should be one place and that there's racial profiling and that there's only certain governments that allow sexual orientation preferences. And so we tend to have tried to move people into these boxes. And as a society and the press, we seem focused on those boxes. So sometimes when I get that question, I react because I realize it's more than just answering it. It's another one of those things. It's how we grow our food or how we connect to nature. It's that we're focusing on something that's actually causing a problem rather than solving it. We're worried about where the big box stores are rather than where the path is to walk spontaneously. And it's that same kind of misdirection in our curiosity.
That's great. So that gives us a good background on sort of who's here and a little bit about what it is. Why did you build it? Or how did you decide to build what really is almost like a little town, but it's technically a neighborhood within the city of Chattahoochee Hills? Like, what drove you to do this?
People are curious, why? How did I come up with this and why did I do this? And this isn't something that I thought out or has always been my dream. And often I wonder, how did I decide to do this? Some mornings when I walk out and realize we have a village here with several hundred people living here and functioning and babies being born and people dying. How on earth did I ever decide to do this? And it really was something that I didn't consciously decide.
Right.
This began as a reaction to save our backyard. And I was one of those pessimistic people, I believe, that was worn down because the political candidates I supported weren't getting elected as much as I thought they should. I served on a lot of state, national, local boards, and I really wasn't getting the change that I was so invested in doing. And so at one point in 94, after we were driving to the farm, which was our weekend place, and I was driving back into Atlanta, and that morning there was a cloud of smog sitting over it. And just something felt like it was the cloud that was over my entire life, that there just things weren't moving. And at that point, I was one of those pessimists that decided the world was never going to be like I thought it should be, and there wasn't anything I could do about it. But I could put my arms around my own family of 3 daughters, and the 5 of us, I could grow our own food. And in that snap decision, I decided to sell a company, to sell the big house, and to step off the treadmill. And so it wasn't out of anger, it was just resignation. And I was totally happy in a retired lifestyle. And then I had a morning that we refer to as the bulldozer story, where I thought houses were coming next door to us. And this was in my 7th year of retirement.
So in 94, you moved down. You had bought this farm, this property down here. You moved down. You were driving back to the city, and you just were kind of had it. Sounds like you kind of had it. And it sort of was a sadness there, but it sounds like you said you're going to refocus inward, and you retired and brought everybody down here.
That's right.
And so how long were you down here before you were saying this other moment?
And it was not this is why I look back. I really wasn't sad.
Okay.
It was just a realization. It felt, this is all bigger. Who am I to think that by serving on a board?
Sure.
Who am I to think that I know who should be the elected person? And it was a real point of resignation. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sad. It was just, let's focus more on what I can control rather than those things that seem beyond my control.
Right.
And that was a big realization for me. And so at that point, that morning I decided to sell the company, which was the big thing. And then following that would be selling the house, and then moving full-time to the country, which was our weekend house. And I was delighted. There was no missing. In fact, people saw, they said I looked 10 years younger. Of course, that was because I was out doing manual labor. I was in the garden. I had great tan. I didn't bother to go to the city to get my hair cut, so I had hair down to my shoulders. So I was in a clearly different lifestyle. And here I was the kid that grew up in the 60s when long hair and hippies was it, and I was the closely clipped corporate executive. So I was going through my 60s rebellion, maybe, although I didn't look at it that way. And so I was in my literally 7th year of retirement when suddenly there was this idea that I could not remain in retreat if I was going to save the paradise we had. And that was the moment that I realized, looking back, that I had to step back into active society, if you will. I couldn't be in this remote place. Mm-hmm. And looking back, I realized why it felt so panicked is it reminded me of where I grew up. I grew up on a farm just 30 miles north of Denver. And my family has been there since the 1860s. And today that's suburban Denver. And that happened over a period of a couple decades.
Wow.
And so where, the ditch banks in the fields that I roamed as a child, I cannot take my children back to. And in my 7 years of retirement, I'd gotten to know some of the people living here in this area south of Atlanta. And they are 7th and 9th generation, some of them. And so even though they had a Southern accent, they reminded me very much of those Midwesterners that I had grown up with and that had been generational family friends for years. And so suddenly that morning, while I can't remember consciously thinking about Colorado, I realized the panic was remembering that on some level. And it was a sense that I had to do something. And there was an urgency to it. Now, I had no idea that urgency was going to lead me into being a developer and to create a community. It was just, I had to step into action. I couldn't stand and watch this area destroyed.
So tell me a little bit more about that moment. So your three daughters that you have, how old were they in 94 when they moved?
When we moved full time, they were 6, 8, and 10.
Okay. And then you're saying 7 years later, you were with one of the daughters?
I was with Garney 7 years later, and we were on our morning jog on what was then our property line.
Mm-hmm.
During those 7 years, I had purchased 2 more pieces of property. I'd put the original 1904 farm back together. And so we had 300 acres. And we had a waterfall and trails and paradise. No, we had 300 acres that we never saw anybody on except us. And so that morning we were jogging, and suddenly we came up over a little hill, and there was a bulldozer bulldozing the forest next to us. And with panic, I ran out to stop the guy. And what are you doing? And he said, we've just been hired to clear the trees. I guess they're putting houses here. That's what always happens. And so that was panic. And when I ran back and tried to call the retired doctor who owned it, who lived a couple counties over, couldn't get him. And 5 weeks later, when he returned, I found out he had sold it to someone down the road who had a little prop plane and wanted to create a pasture airstrip. But in that 5 weeks of panic of trying to save my own backyard, I had another 600 acres under contract. And various stories on how that happened. It just seemed amazing. Some of these properties had been held for 3 generations, and suddenly it was a time to sell. And so there's stories behind each of those. And so I was then sitting with 900 acres, and I realized I couldn't continue buying property to save our backyard. And 900 acres didn't really protect us from urban sprawl. And so I was in that unique position of being concerned about our environment and protecting this wonderful rural landscape, yet protecting my investment of the money I had invested in these 900 acres. And that curiosity, concern is what really led to the development of Serenbe.
You've told me at some point that when you started making those phone calls to these neighboring landowners, kind of tell me a little bit about that, because I think you had said that, everybody was kind of willing to sell. So tell me that story.
One piece, it was a beautiful piece of land. It's where Grange is now located. And some of our city friends who were coming down in those 3 years that this was a weekend were curious in other property. And so we had contacted the elderly woman who owned it, and she said, she would sell it for some astronomical price that her daddy told her that one day it would be worth that. And of course, that was a totally unrealistic. So I thought, I've got to go back and talk to her, because maybe a developer would offer her or negotiate it. And I just got to know what's going on and be a party to it. And so after visiting with her for 2 hours on her sofa that was all covered with white sheets, the whole room was covered in white sheets, she said, maybe you should talk to this lady. And she handed me a card of a lawyer in Decatur. Well, it turns out that week, her nieces had had her removed as executor because she hadn't paid taxes in 5 years, and they had to sell the property. The next person I called said, he said, I inherited this land from my dad, and I'm in a nasty divorce, and this is the only thing outside the divorce. I will gladly sell it because I have no funds. And the third person I called said, we bought this property 30 years ago to raise our kids. They're gone, and we just returned from LJ with our grandchildren, and we made the decision we're going to call a realtor and sell this and move to LJ. So here were 3 very different stories. All people at that moment had decided to sell or needed to sell. I have no idea what that means, just coincidental. Are we in a destiny? I don't know. But that began the purchase of the property, and then that was both an opportunity and a responsibility that I suddenly felt.
So fast forward. Today, it's 2019 when we're recording this, and we have over 700 people living here. You've built out 3 neighborhoods, right? We call them hamlets. What should we know about those neighborhoods and sort of what's unique about them?
Well, I believe that to answer that, you almost have to understand the next step of my story. And as we were doing the research on how do we save this, it led to a conversation with a dear friend, Ray Anderson. Environmentalists would know Ray as the founder of Interface Carpet. And he was one of the early voices in the environment. When the White House created the Council on the Environment in the 90s, he was the first chair. But he had been a dear friend for years, his stepson, godfather to our now 30-year-old. And so I asked Ray if he knew some of the smart people that he was associated with that could help me figure out how to help preserve this area right here on the edge of Atlanta. And Ray is really the one who then introduced me to a lot of the leading environmentalists. He asked the Rocky Mountain Institute to assist. They assembled 23 thought leaders here in September of 2000. To put this in perspective, this is before anyone had even heard of LEED certification. There weren't many voices in the environmental movement in 2000, and you can name a lot of them. And so it was because of Ray, and Ray is the one who really pushed me through that threshold of passion. I can't remember the day it happened, but I remember the resistance that I was going to step back into an active life doing anything, because I was pretty happy in retirement,
Sure.
To that place that I absolutely had to do it. And there was no obstacle that I wasn't determined to pass, because it became a passion that this was much bigger than just saving my neighborhood, that this wasn't complicated, but it just wasn't being done. And so that really set me on looking at what are the elements that lead to a vital lifestyle. And it started out as preserving the land. And now here we are in 2019. And it's what really creates a healthy lifestyle, because we're now looking at health and wellness. And what are we going to do about that in America and in the world? And I think we're at a place where we were 20 years ago with the environment, where we knew something had to be done, but we weren't sure what. And that's where we are in health and wellness. And if I look at what Serenbe is doing today, and maybe one of the biggest things we can contribute to is being a model on how we can live a healthier lifestyle as a result of the built environment.
So Ray sort of pushed you. He brought all of these environmental issues sort of to light for you and sort of pushed you to do this. And so it started off with saving the land, which makes sense. It's gorgeous. But then you really started thinking about what makes a well-lived life. And I've heard you say that before. And I'm sort of taken by that, because I don't know if a lot of us stop and think, what does make a well-lived life, right? You know, I'm just sort of going about my thing, right? I'm growing up, going to college, having a job, getting married, get kids. You know, it's sort of this process, but am I really being mindful or thoughtful about it? So as you said about thinking about not maybe the sustainable environmental aspects of Serenbe, but what was a well-lived life, what were those sort of tenets that you sort of identified or you thought of for yourself was a well-lived life? What are those?
Well, thinking in my own life, when I was opening restaurants around the country, we had a beautiful home in an in-town neighborhood in Atlanta with the pool, the media room, Barbie cars for all three girls with batteries. It was what we thought of as the ideal life, serving on boards, going to the key balls for health and for arts and for political events. And we were in that what appeared to be an ideal lifestyle, and we were happy in it. We weren't looking for a change. And then a afternoon drive changed our lives. And then 7 years later, really 10 years later from then when we first purchased the property, I was in this place of analyzing the difference, because those 7 years, we weren't doing any of the balls. We didn't have the big house. We weren't on that ideal success treadmill. And what was giving us joy? Well, it was our own garden and harvesting our food. It was traveling to Europe with the family and these little walking villages from 100, 200 years ago. It was visiting some of the historic places in the Southeast, where was the foundation of America and what did those places look like? Now, in all of those 7 years when we were traveling with the family, that was just because I was lucky enough that we could do it. I wasn't thinking of it as research. But all of a sudden, when I start thinking about if we're going to create a place, and it was the realization that the only way we were going to preserve not only our farm, but the greater area, it was we had to find a balance between development and preservation. And that is a balance that anyone developing 100 years ago naturally had. But we have today separated, and developers seem to be on one side looking at the quarterly return for development, and the preservationists have become on the other side. And they're the two groups that sue each other in zoning battles. And so here I was with a foot in each camp, and we needed to find out a way to bring this together. And if I looked back 80, 100 years, it was naturally together. There wasn't a separation. And so that's where I really focused is both what were the principles of that time, and then what were some of the physical and social aspects that were happening in those times. The rural England was one of our best examples physically, because after World War II, they put good land laws in because realizing the island was only so big, they had the foresight to realize they could not indulge in the corporate or in the urban sprawl that was about to happen.
Interesting.
And so if you visit the countryside of England, you drive through country, and then you see in the distance the hamlet or the village and the town, and you actually drive into the edge of it. And they've got a lot of people living in those places, but you still feel the countryside. And so that was our best model. And of course, there's a whole story on how we brought English land law to a property rights southern state.
So that's interesting to sort of give us a reference point, because I know when people come here, and I've given people tours or I have friends or family, it's very hard to describe it. And until you get here, you don't really, I don't want to say get it, but you don't really get it. You don't really understand it. You sort of have to feel the land. Is there another reference point, or is really England the best? English villages, is that the best reference point? Because it really isn't a typical neighborhood that we've seen in the U.S., at least.
It's very difficult to say we are like, because there is really no place that we're like, sadly enough. If you want to look at land use, you look to England. I can think of places you can look that's growing their food near where people live. I can think of communities that have an importance and honor the arts still. If you look at the blue zone communities, that shows you communities that have health. So there's various places that have components of this. It reminds me of various times, but specifically, I was taken. It was, I think, maybe the first time. It was 2 or 3 years ago, and there was a woman in her 60s, or couple in their 60s, and they were looking where they might retire in a couple of years. And they had seen me on the street and recognized me on a Friday, and we chatted briefly. And then I saw them on that Sunday after they'd been here 48 hours. And she had this curiosity in her eye and was asking me, what is this place? Is it real?
Right.
And it was when I was just starting to get those kind of questions that people were seeing Serenbe as someplace special, and they were starting to ask it. And I hadn't really been able to articulate it, and it's still difficult to articulate it. But I asked her what it was that she had seen and experienced in the previous 48 hours that made her ask if this place was real. And she talked about the kids, and she didn't see their parents running freely. She talked about seeing people bringing fresh food from the farm. She talked about seeing neighbors sitting on their front porches talking to people walking down the streets. It was a lot of just civil interaction. And this is a woman in her 60s, and I said, "Where did you grow up?" And she told me about this mid-sized town in the Northeast. And I said, "Well, tell me, what did you see that was different in this 48 hours than from where you grew up as a child?" And she just almost turned white and sat back and looked at me, and she said, "Absolutely nothing." And isn't it sad that in 5 or 6 decades, we now accept where we live, that it's places that do not have these simple courtesies and respect for one another. That today, when you see that at Serenbe, you think it's unusual. You think it isn't real. Mm-hmm. And that was just my first eye-opener that, whoa, what we've done here is something very special. And a sadness that what has happened to us that we've stepped away from some of this simple respect for one another and for nature.
So Serenbe is not a typical neighborhood. Over the past 70 years, there's a whole historical of how we came to sort of suburban and the suburbs. And so many of the places that we think of as, quote, developments or community developments have gates. They've got key cards. A lot of them don't even have sidewalks. Big old lawns with a, garage attached to the house. They've got maybe a place to gather, a swim or tennis club within, but, you're there doing those two things, or maybe you throw a birthday party for your kids. But I don't see those things here. I mean, we have amenities, if you will. There's a swim club, but give me a mental picture as you walk in or you come into Serenbe for the first time. What am I going to see?
If you're coming for the first time, you probably think you're lost because you're coming down country road. And because of the base zoning that we've created for the greater 40,000 acres, it requires that there's buffers on all of our roads and all development happens interiorly. So the rural landscape has been preserved for the greater area. So you're really convinced that you must be lost. And then you're generally searching for that big entrance gate. And of course, there's a little sign with a turn lane. And people arrive really concerned that they're out here in this unknown place and they must have taken a wrong turn. And the first thing you're going to see then is a beautiful stable sitting on the hill with paddocks and horses running. And so this really captures that you're in a rural landscape. And you come a little further and you see something that's very quaint. It's a little a settlement of 16 houses, 4 townhouses, and these 2 little live works with apartments above them. There's the bike shop and the flower shop. And it's just this little nestling, a little cluster of houses, and they're all painted white with little picket fences. And suddenly it feels that you've arrived at a movie set. And so you've hit this immediate dichotomy of the rural landscape in this little village right here on the edge of the city. And so I think people become curious and it's sort of isn't the expectation. And of course, you come a little further and you see this beautiful park with a boardwalk on it. And what people don't realize is that's our wastewater treatment center that's all naturally. And you might see people having their picture taken because it's one of the most photographed areas of all of Serenbe. So this starts to really outline, whether you know it or not, what a different but common sense place this is. And then most people are surprised to see then as they come into Selborne, our first community, the street lights commissioned by an artist, that there's 4 restaurants, there's a busy activity. You might see the billboards for the theater session that's coming on, and all of a sudden you're in a very culturally obvious place. That's a total difference than what you expect to find in rural Georgia. And people at this point are starting to ask, where am I? The more pessimist people think it's a movie set. The people that are looking for hope are totally inspired and want to know more, and their curiosity is totally opened. The thing that I find unusual or sad that people find amazing is how everyone's smiling and waving, and it becomes contagious. After you've been here an hour, you start looking people in the eye and greeting them. And it's a contagious feeling that by the time they leave, they're also nodding and waving to people. And generally everyone comments about the kids that they see. It's just amazing to me that today that's one of the main things that the people see is kids. So, and then if you go a little further, and either if you're at Grange or the Inn, you see a trampoline. Now, sometimes you're looking at the landscape and you just see people bouncing, and it looks like they're bouncing off but our trampolines are buried in the ground. And to me, that's a good example of common sense. When I guess when we moved out here, she was 5, 6, wanted a trampoline. I refused to do it because I was afraid that she was going to break something or be permanently injured. And the more she asked, as a father, the more I wanted to give her what she wanted, but I didn't want to put her in danger. And finally, I thought about, well, why not bury it? The problem is falling off. And so I think that trampoline is an example that we many times resist out of fear rather than thinking about the common sense issues. And that's what Serenbe really represents. It's to step out of fear, but not to ignore the issues, to really look at what it is we're afraid of and how do we accomplish the same thing in a more real way.
Yeah, you're right. It's a pretty profound observation. I might call that the trampoline metaphor going forward. I've got one more question for you. So people have heard a little bit. I'm hoping they're getting a sense of sort of what Serenbe is and what they might expect when they get here. Once you are here, besides with seeing happy people on the street and beautiful homes, and what would you tell people to do here? Like, what are their options on a typical week at Serenbe?
Well, first I have to ask who the person is, because some people are looking for a break from their busy lifestyle. And for that person, I would say find our trails. Find the bench that's on the stream. Clear your mind by walking the labyrinth, and so you can walk the woods and hear the birds and really see the various species of wildlife and flowers that are blooming in the field. So you just connect back to nature, and you'll find that peace that's maybe driving you crazy. You have other people that are looking for something to do, and so start visiting the restaurants. Go to the wine tasting. If it's theater season, we're going to have theater like 40 weeks this coming year. Or maybe it's ballet. Check what's going on here. There's always an art activity, an art show. There are things happening here. If you're interested in food and agriculture, our farm is a teaching farm. There's scheduled tours. You want to check our schedule. And we post the complete schedule on our webpage because there are so many things happening at Serenbe. We can't possibly talk about everything, but just go to our calendar at our webpage at www.serenbe.com, and you can start planning your visit before you get here, so you kind of know. Some things you do have to make reservations for. The restaurants are busy. The theaters sell out. People fly in from literally all over. If they've seen one production, sometimes they buy their season tickets and come from all over. So you can have both a meditative experience or a very engaged experience. And sometimes it's addressing the needs for a couple that many times we have different things. And so you can balance it between those two.
Well, this is great. I really thank you for your time. I'm very excited to dig in more at another episode. I'll talk more about the farmhouse, talk more about how you got here, and how your kids sort of grew up here before it became Serenbe. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you. So many stories to tell. So glad we're telling them.
Thank you for listening to Serenbe Stories. New episodes are available on Mondays. You can subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts. For more details, visit our website, serenbestories.com.